Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today I'm gonna tell you 3 stories that demonstrate. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please break into the like button's water supply and fill it with permanent red dye. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At about 8:20 in the morning on June 29th, 2025, an 83-year-old woman named June Baxter shuffled her way down the hallway of her small home in Attleborough, which is a quiet town in eastern England. As she walked, she had to keep one hand on the wall to keep her balance. She was pretty frail these days and also just had a lot of medical problems, but she also really valued her independence. And so she was determined to keep living alone, even if it was kind of risky. So, June used to live with her husband and their dog, but about 7 years earlier, her husband had gotten really sick, and so because of that, they'd had to give their dog to their granddaughter because they just couldn't take care of it anymore and also care for him. And then unfortunately, June's husband did pass away, and so she was left all alone. But even though she was, all alone in terms of living in the house by herself, she wasn't completely isolated. Her granddaughter, who she had given the dog to, lived close by unvisited a whole bunch and almost always brought along June's old dog, which June loved. Now, in addition to just being good company, June's granddaughter also regularly made herself available to help June with all sorts of basic things, like, picking up her prescriptions and going grocery shopping for her and, driving her to and from doctor's appointments. Like she was really available to her. But despite June knowing that, knowing she could always call on her, she tried hard not to call on her granddaughter cause again, she just really liked being independent. So on this particular day, she, continued slowly walking down the hallway. Guiding herself by holding onto the wall. And then she turned the corner to go to the bathroom. And when she stepped inside, she slipped on the tile. And as she was falling to the ground, her leg scraped the corner of the bathroom counter. Immediately, June's leg started bleeding and June's yelling out in pain, but she lives alone. Nobody can hear her. And so June quickly went from, just reacting to the pain and the blood. June was scared. I mean, this is the exact scenario that she was so worried about, Getting hurt when she was all alone, cause she didn't really have a plan. It was like, I'm gonna live alone, so help me. But fortunately for June, she had installed throughout her house all these emergency call bells that would allow her to basically, hit the bell. And they were programmed to contact both her granddaughter and also the local emergency services. And in the bathroom, there was one of these bells, and so once she kind of composed herself a little bit, she grabbed the string for this bell and she pulled it. About 10 minutes later, June was still in the bathroom on the ground holding onto her leg wound when she heard the front door of her house swing open. And immediately she heard the sound of her granddaughter calling out for her. And June, as best as she could, even though her voice was a little bit weak, she called out and said where she was. A moment later, June's granddaughter, along with June's old dog she had brought along, came bombing around the corner. And they looked into the bathroom and they saw, June and her horrible leg wound. And clearly, the granddaughter is really worried right away. I mean, this was a very bad cut. But, for June, she's looking at her granddaughter and she's just flooded with relief because she knows no matter how bad this is, her granddaughter is here, everything's fine. And also her dog was here, which made everything better already. And so while June's granddaughter began rummaging through the bathroom to look for some bandages, June just kind of relaxed and just began petting her dog, who was clearly very worried about June. This is her dog. Previously, they had a very strong bond. So, she's just petting her dog and then, June's granddaughter did find some bandages and she wrapped up June's leg. And then by the time the paramedics got there, June actually was feeling basically okay. I mean, her leg definitely hurt, but she was very calm at this point. A couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and by this point, June was actually feeling basically back to normal. I mean, her leg definitely still hurt, but again, her granddaughter had put that dressing on it and basically stopped the bleeding. And also, June has her dog that she's petting like her comfort animal, and so she was very calm. The paramedics come in and they assess her, and they take off the dressing to check the wound. And after they cleaned it, they said, "Look, this is a pretty minor cut. You don't even need stitches. I think you're okay. Just be careful, and maybe have your granddaughter stay here for a little bit just to make sure you don't fall again. But you're okay. We're gonna go." And so June, she thanked the paramedics as they walked out the door, and then she and her granddaughter and the dog just sort of sat there feeling grateful that this fall wasn't more serious. However, the next morning when June woke up, she knew something was wrong because, all she's doing is laying in bed, but her heart is racing, she's sweating, she's lightheaded, clearly something is off here. Now the day before, after the paramedics left, her granddaughter did stick around for a little bit. But really, June was okay. And so June was alone, and that night, she had some soreness around the cut. But it really wasn't that serious. She really felt like she dodged a bullet there. But now, 12 hours later, something's going on here. Now June had no way of knowing if her current symptoms were indeed connected to her, minor cut on her leg did. But her concern that maybe this was serious and could potentially spiral really quickly made her not pull on one of those emergency bells. But instead, she just picked up the phone and called an ambulance to take her to the hospital. When she got to the hospital, doctors immediately began running all these tests on her. Very quickly, they determined that she did have a very severe bacterial infection, which she must have gotten after cutting her leg. And unfortunately, that infection had already spread into her blood, which would explain why she was feeling sweaty and lightheaded and why her heart was racing. Now, the medical staff definitely had some questions like, how in the world could this have developed so quickly? Especially after the paramedics the day before had, at least according to them, properly cleaned this wound before they left. But, their issue now was not how did this happen, but instead, just stabilize June. Treat her. And so right away, they began treating June with general antibiotics to try to fight off this infection, but it just wasn't working. And June was 83 and already in relatively poor health, and her condition was clearly deteriorating rapidly. So the doctors began running more tests to try to determine exactly what type of bacteria was causing this infection, because if they knew that, they might be able to give her more targeted treatment than just general antibiotics, which clearly were not working. And they did eventually identify this bacteria, but by the time they did, June had unfortunately already developed sepsis, which is a life-threatening condition that occurs when a person's body tries so hard to fight off an infection that it basically ends up damaging their vital organs in the process. Medical staff did everything they could, but it wasn't enough, and so eventually, 1 week after going to the hospital, June passed away. It would turn out the deadly bacteria that found its way into June's open wound was introduced to her by her granddaughter completely by accident. The bacteria is called Pasteurella multisodus, and it's found in a very specific place inside the mouths of domestic dogs. While June laid on the bathroom floor waiting for her granddaughter to find bandages to wrap up her leg, June's old beloved dog, who her granddaughter had brought over, was trying to comfort June. And June was allowing the dog to do that, but what the dog was actually doing to comfort June, was licking her open wound. And so that led to the bacteria going in, and it would kill June 1 week later. On the afternoon of March 4th, 2000, a 40-year-old woman named Ines Ramirez stood in the kitchen of her 91-room home, which was deep in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico. Ines had a whole chicken on the counter right in front of her that she had just killed and plucked, and now she was using a 6-inch long knife to butcher it for their dinner. And as she did this, every once in a while, She would look out the window to check on her 7 kids who were playing together out in the yard. So Ines and her large family lived in a very isolated rural community of about, maybe, 500 people. They didn't have running water or electricity or a phone, and they lived miles away from their closest neighbors. They mainly lived off of corn and vegetables that they grew themselves, chickens they raised, and then wild animals that Ines's husband would catch. Her husband was actually gone that day because he was out in the mountains hunting for deer. And so as Ines is just kind of going about her fairly typical evening routine here, making dinner, she suddenly felt this really intense, very painful cramping sensation that was kind of ripping through her abdomen. And it hurt so bad that Ines stopped what she was doing and kind of doubled over and grabbed the counter and just tried to steady her breathing. I mean, this was really shocking. And for about a minute, Ines just stood there, holding onto the counter, just waiting for this pain to pass. And eventually it did. And once it eased up, it was like, okay, she was back to normal and she could stand up again. But this was sort of alarming. But at the same time, Ines was used to dealing with basically all medical crises on her own. They lived in this isolated part of the world, and the nearest medical clinic was 50 miles away, and they didn't have a car. So like anything that happened, they basically had to deal with it themselves, and that was routine. And so for Ines, despite how incredibly painful this was, she just told herself, now that it had passed, the pain was gone. She said, "You know what to do. It's probably fine. I'm good." And so pretty quickly, she just kind of forgot about it and went back to butchering the chicken. But several hours later, this is after midnight now, the pain came right back. And at this point, Ines, she's in this one common room in her house where all her kids are fast asleep. It's past midnight now, and she's sitting on this bench, and she's gripping her abdomen, rocking back and forth as this pain just rockets back and forth across her abdomen constantly. There's no relief, nothing. And she's trying so hard not to make a sound, cause she doesn't want to wake her kids up, nor does she want to scare her kids. Her husband is still off in the mountains hunting for deer, so she is alone. She just has this little flickering candle nearby. That's the only light she's got. And she's just isolated, dealing with this excruciating pain. And so at this point, Ines really felt like this could be a real problem. This might not be something she could just brush off and let pass on its own. This was real. This was an actual emergency. But what can she even do? There's nowhere to go or to go. She can't do anything. She's just completely trapped here with this excruciating pain that's making it hard to even have coherent thought. It's so bad. But the one thought that kept going through her mind was she had to do something. Or whatever this was, it felt like it was going to kill her. And so Ines felt like she really only had one option here. And it was a horrible, horrible option, but she knew she had to do it. And so she got up and she's hunched over in pain, and as quietly as she could, she walked over to a cabinet and she opened it up. And she grabbed a small bottle of alcohol, and she took a few sips to kind of numb the pain a little bit. And then after she had done that, she turned around and, still with this blinding pain, she hobbled into the kitchen and she grabbed that 6-inch knife she had used earlier to butcher the chicken. And then she walked right back over to the bench near the candle that she had been sitting on earlier. And once she was there, she reached down and she pulled up her shirt, exposing her abdomen, where this pain was coming from. And then she took the knife and she plunged it into her abdomen. And immediately she let out this blood-curdling scream. She couldn't help it. And she was sort of vaguely aware of all her kids waking up and sort of making their way over to her. But she was so focused on what she was doing. And she began slowly dragging this blade down her abdomen all the way to her belly button. And then she pulled out the knife, and she can barely think. It's so painful. Her kids are crying. And then she plunged the knife back into her abdomen and dragged it down the other side, creating this massive gash in her stomach. And then she kind of dropped the knife, and she's screaming. She can't even help it, and her kids are all crying. And she takes her hand, and she reaches into her stomach, and she's fishing around. Every little move is like lightning striking her body. But she eventually finds what she's looking for, and she pulls it out of her stomach. And what she's looking at is her 8th child, a baby boy. And she had enough wherewithal to take that knife and cut the umbilical cord and place the baby down before she passed out. After Ines lost consciousness, one of her kids left the house and just started running to go find the nearest person to get some help. And miraculously, after finding some people, when those first responders got to the home where Ines was hours later, they found her and her newborn son alive. And they were taken to the closest hospital for emergency treatment, and they would both make full recoveries. Today, Ines Ramirez is the only woman ever who has performed a successful C-section on herself. In the early morning hours of December 3rd, 1921, a 62-year-old woman named Augusta Roblin lay awake in her bedroom inside of her daughter's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Augusta had lived with her daughter now for about a year. She had moved in after her husband had passed away. She just really hated being alone. And at night in particular, it was difficult to sleep sometimes, Just the weight of the loneliness was very intense. And also, Augusta was known to have really visceral bad dreams. And so that, combined with loneliness, made living alone really awful. So here she was living with her daughter, but on this particular night, Augusta, she was wide awake in bed because she had had one of these awful nightmares. But she knew she could not tell her daughter about it. Now normally, one of the ways that Augusta would cope with these terrible nightmares, even when she was living alone, is she would get in touch with her daughter and they would talk about it. They would try to figure out if there was meaning in this awfulness of these nightmares, and sometimes they felt like they did find deeper meaning, and it sort of was cathartic for Augusta. But on this night, the dream she had just had, this nightmare, this visceral, awful nightmare, she knew, based on what she believed it meant, she absolutely could not tell her daughter anything about it. She had to hide it at all costs. In the dream Augusta had just had, she kind of came to when she was in her daughter's basement. So, in the basement of the house she was in right now, and in front of her on the ground were these two perfectly circular, very, very deep holes, just that went straight into the ground. And so Augusta, she found herself walking towards the edge and looking over, and she saw it was like this unbelievable abyss in each hole. It's like it went on into infinity. But despite this innate fear she had for these holes, she sat down on the edge of one of these holes and basically dangled her feet over this, cataclysmic abyss below her. And as she's sitting there like a child dangling her feet, these two men in dark clothes, they wander over out of the shadows and they walk behind Augusta. They don't interact with her, and they go to the other hole, the hole that is next to Augusta. And she looks at these men, and they're not looking at her. They're doing something. They're clearly in the middle of some sort of act. And they pull this huge carpet, seemingly out of nowhere, and the two men stretch it out over this other hole next to Augusta. And they lay it over the hole. And as soon as Augusta saw that, she suddenly understood what was happening here, and she was horrified. So she woke up, and now here she was, knowing that based on what she just saw in her mind's eye in this horrible nightmare, that she could never share it with anyone, that she would live with the secret. So, Augusta would eventually fall back to sleep that night, and she would get up in the morning and she would not tell her daughter, Henrietta, anything about this dream she had had. She played it off like everything was just fine. Over the course of the day, Henrietta, even though she didn't say anything, began to notice that her mom was just acting really weird, like something was on her mind. And finally at night, when the two of them sat down for dinner, this is basically, 24 hours give or take from when Augusta had this dream. Right. They're sitting down for dinner, and Augusta, she's not eating. She seems totally disconnected, and she just seems off. And Henrietta's like, "Mom, what is going on with you?" And Augusta at this point realized she must be giving off very negative vibes here. And so she told her daughter, "Don't worry, I'm fine. I'm sorry, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine. I'm just feeling a little bit off. So everything's fine." But Henrietta realistically did not believe her mom, but she didn't push her. She said okay, and they finished their dinner, and then before long, Augusta had gone to bed. But the next morning, when Henrietta got up, she went downstairs expecting to see her mom, but Augusta was nowhere to be found. And so again, feeling kind of concerned about her mom's behavior, she went to Augusta's bedroom to check on her. And she found her mom seeming really weak and lethargic and just totally out of it, laying in bed. And she asked her mom, like, really? What's going on with you? Are you not feeling well? What's happening here? And her mom just said, like, I just don't want to get out of bed. I'm feeling under the weather. I'm gonna stay here. But even though Henrietta could see her mom was clearly downplaying this, she just felt like there's too many red flags. So she called a doctor, and the doctor came to the house, and the doctor examined Augusta, and they determined that, it wasn't really clear exactly what was going on with her. Clearly she's not feeling great, but the only thing they found was that her heart sounded a little bit weak. And so the doctor suggested that Augusta just, rest, have some water, eat some food, and just stay in bed, and you should get better. But despite Augusta doing what the doctor said and basically remaining on bed rest, she didn't get better at all. And in fact, Henrietta, her daughter, is watching, and she's clearly seeing that not only is her mother deteriorating physically, but she was also becoming more and more despondent and sort of disconnected emotionally. It was like she was drifting off into some other world that Henrietta was not a part of. And she was just so worried about her mom. And so finally, on December 7th, so this is for reference, 5 days after Augusta had that visceral nightmare that she felt like she couldn't share with anybody, Henrietta went into her mother's room. And she sat on the edge of the bed, and she said to her mom, "You gotta tell me what's going on. It seems like there's something else here that you're not sharing with me. You gotta tell me. I don't care what it is, but I gotta know." Augusta, when she heard her daughter saying this, she sort of thought about trying to keep doing the same thing she was doing, which was, basically say everything's fine and push her daughter off. But she could tell Henrietta was not going to take that for an answer. And so Augusta sighed and she said, "I had that dream again, except this time, I watched the procedure." Now to us, this is, cryptic and weird and doesn't really mean anything. But to Henrietta, who understood what her mom was talking about, she was completely horrified. It would turn out Augusta really did have, horrible nightmares that plagued her for at least the last year or so, but it was like a recurring nightmare. She didn't have different variations. It basically was the exact same nightmare that just really upset her. The way it went is, she would open her eyes in this nightmare, and in front of her would be these bottomless pits, these huge holes in the ground. Now she wouldn't know what these holes are, but she'd be able to tell that she was in an environment that she recognized. One time she saw that she was in her sister-in-law's garden. Another time she saw she was in her neighbor's backyard. Like she knew where she was, but she didn't understand these holes. But in this nightmare, she would always walk up to the holes, and then, not to men who walked in, but she would take a rug out and cover up one of those holes, and then she'd wake up. Now on its face, this does not sound like a particularly frightening dream, but there's a connection to the real world that made it frightening. Every time Augusta would have these nightmares, the person who lived at the property where the dream took place, the sister-in-law's garden, the neighbor's backyard, when she would have that dream, she would come to, and then within a couple of days, that person would die, usually inexplicably. It was like a harbinger of doom that these dreams represented who was going to die next. And so, every time she had this dream, she knew someone's going to die. But in that last dream she had, the one, 5 days earlier that scared her so badly she knew she couldn't tell Henrietta in that dream me. It was the first time she, Augusta, didn't perform the procedure, right? By putting the rug over one of the holes. Those two men came over and they did it, and Augusta realized she's sitting with her feet in the other hole, and she's realizing she's in her daughter's basement. That's where this dream is taking place. This must mean she, Augusta, is next up. And wouldn't you know it, just days after telling her daughter about this, within 2 weeks of having this dream, Augusta died of heart failure in her daughter's house. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here, so give it a watch here. Alright, until next time, see ya. So, today's story is a very creepy one. In fact, it's so unsettling at times that you're very likely going to think it's just fake. But there was a pretty incredible discovery that was made in the early 1900 seconds that very likely means the story is true. But before we get into that incredible campfire story, as you can see, I'm literally sitting by a campfire. And honestly, it was just because, you know, what I sort of do is I tell scary campfire stories a lot of the times. But I never actually sit by a fire. And so we decided, why not literally make a campfire and tell a spooky story by it? And if this vibe is something you guys like, I'm more than happy to do more of these because this sort of breaks it up. It's cool. It sort of adds a new flavor to the channel. And so, let us know if you enjoy this vibe, and we'll do more. And I think that, generally speaking, when we do literal campfire stories, I'm gonna lean towards the stories that are of the spook, i.e. our variety. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right campfire because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button too, to come to your campfire and cook some seamers with you. But don't tell them you've secretly put firecrackers in their marshmallows. Okay, let's get into today's story. Hundreds of years ago, there was this young indigenous warrior who was on his way to the center of his village. And his village was located in this heavily forested, rolling hills area of modern-day Richland County, Wisconsin. He was a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation, this indigenous tribe, and that's where they called home. And as this young warrior, the strong, brave young man, is walking towards the village center, he had been called there by his tribal chief. He sort of had an idea of why he was being called there. And sure enough, when he got to the village center and he sees his tribal chief, who's standing there with 9 of the other strongest and bravest men of the tribe, this warrior knew, his hunch was correct. So, 2 days earlier, 3 teenage boys that were members of this tribe, they had gone out deer hunting in the wilds right outside of their village. Again, this is a heavily forested, beautiful rolling hills area, and these teenagers had not come back. They had just been gone now for 48 hours, and their respective families were worried, and they had been, telling the tribal chief that they really needed to send out a search party for them. But the chief had sort of held off, in part because it wasn't entirely uncommon for hunters, even young hunters, to go out for a couple of days at a time. But the family they had a bad feeling about it. And so finally, the tribal chief relented to days in, and he was calling a search party together to go look for these young men. And so the warrior who's walked into the village center here, he was being asked by the tribal chief too to lead this search party effort. He was going to be in charge of these 9 other men. And so, the warrior, in truth, he sort of felt like it was overkill to put together this huge search party for these teenagers that, in his mind, he really did think they were just fine. But he didn't want to undermine the tribal chief, and so he said, "Of course I'll go do it." And so the warrior, along with the 9 other, strong, brave members of the tribe, they gather up some weapons and some food and water, cause they didn't know how long the search was going to take. They said goodbye to the members of the village, and then they exited the village in the same direction that basically all the hunters would go when they would go on hunting expeditions. There was like sort of a well-worn path that led out into the wilds of the forest. And so the warrior, who's again leading the search party, he was a skilled hunter himself. And as he's walking along this well-worn trail, he quickly found the tracks of these teenage boys. So they identified the tracks, and, right away the warrior's thinking, this is gonna be, no big deal. We're gonna follow these tracks, we're gonna find the kids, they probably are out camping somewhere. We'll give them a stern talking to and bring them back home, and that'll be that. But, as they're following the tracks along the well-worn trail, eventually the tracks, they deviate and they leave the trail. And they start kind of veering off into not really uncharted territory, but certainly areas that were not necessarily known for good hunting. This tribe, where they were, prolific hunters. And so they knew this area extremely well. And they really had the designated areas that were the best. And so already they're seeing that these boys, they're doing something different, or they're doing something that's not advantageous for hunting. But either way, they're following these tracks that are going for miles and miles just into the wild. And also, as they're moving along here, they start to notice that there's no point at which the boys stop. There's no, tracks that indicated they came to a stop and rested, or, stood still and tried to kill a deer or something. It was like they were just on a mission, hiking deep into the wilds. And so, the warrior's keeping a lot of these insights to himself, and he's just following the tracks. But after hours of this, when they still have not found the boys, they eventually found themselves at the top of this ravine. And as they're looking down into it, they realize that they've gone so far not only away from their village, but so far off, the beaten paths that they were familiar with from all their hunting, that they knew this was an area that they really had never been to before. And they had no idea, what was down in the ravine or what was beyond. I mean, this is sort of uncharted territory for the warrior and the search party. But what they did know is that the tracks of these teenage boys continue down into this ravine. And so down the ravine they went. And then when they got to the bottom of the steep ravine, the trees kind of cleared out a little bit. And right in front of them where the tracks continued is this opening to a cave. And it's so dark inside that they really have no sense of how far back it goes or anything. But they see the tracks that they're following of the teenagers led into that cave, but there are no tracks coming back out again. And so presumably, the teenage boys, for reasons totally unknown, have hiked all the way out here, have gone into that cave, and that's where they are. But again, from the outside, the warrior and the others, they can't see these teenagers. And so naturally, the group, they walk up to the mouth of the cave, and even up close, it's starting to get a little bit dark outside, but there's still some daylight. Even up close, they can't see very far into the cave. It's just very dark. I mean, it's clearly big enough inside that you could walk for a great distance, or a pretty decent distance, but at some point, it must sort of bend off and go in a different direction, and they can't see the teenagers inside of there. And so the warrior, at this point, has a level of apprehension here, cause he doesn't know this cave, he doesn't know this area, he doesn't know what's happened to these teenagers, he doesn't know if they're okay or not in there, he doesn't know if there's a predator or something inside of this cave. And so what he does is he decides, okay, I'm gonna send 2 of my men of the search party in there to scout this out, and the rest of us will stay out here and just wait. And so he designates the 2 who say okay, and they go into the cave. And so the warrior and the 7 other men that he's with, they're just standing outside of the cave, and they're listening intently. Because these 2 men that are going in there, they're calling out the names of the missing teenagers. They're yelling. And, all they can hear from the outside is just the sound of the 2 men yelling. They're not hearing any response from the teenagers. It's just quiet inside of the cave. And again, from the warrior and the other search party members' perspective, they can only see the 2 men that have gone in for a little while. Then they kind of disappear into the darkness. But they can still kind of hear them as they're calling out for the boys' names. They're calling and calling. And then, around the same time that the warrior and the others, he was with lost sight of the 2 men that went in looking for the boys, At the same time that too, they lost sight of them, they stopped making noise. It's like the cave went completely silent. And so for about 5 minutes or so, the warrior and the others, they're just kind of anxiously waiting, what's going on in there. But it's completely silent. 10 minutes goes by and then 15, and it is dead silence. There's nothing coming out of the cave. It's just eerily quiet. And so the warrior at this point, he tells the others to stay put, and he just steps a little ways into the cave, just enough that, he was sort of inside the entrance of the cave, and he began calling out the name of the two men who went in, but now they're missing as well. He's calling their names out as he's yelling their names and sort of echoing through what appears to be a vast cave system, but there's no response. At least not at first. If there had been no response, it would have told him at least, okay, maybe they're hurt or they're too far away. I can't hear them. But instead, he did get a sort of response, but he couldn't make any sense of it. He heard what sounded like a wailing sound coming from deep inside of this cave, way deep inside. This wail that at first it sounded like one voice, and then it sounded like multiple voices kind of layered on top of each other. And then with this sudden realization, the warrior understood what he was hearing. It wasn't a cry. He was hearing a chant. And it was a very particular chant, very particular to the Ho-Chunk Nation. It was the chant that warriors did before they died. It was literally known as the death song. And as soon as the main warrior is hearing the death song being chanted deep inside of this cave, the other men he's with, the 7 others who know exactly what that song is, they all sprung forward and said, "What do? We have to go in. There's something wrong." And before the lead warrior could tell them what to do, 6 of the other men just charged into the cave, chasing down their brothers because they believe they're about to die. They would never be singing that song, chanting that song, if they weren't in real danger. And so the lead warrior and the one other guy that stayed back, they stayed put, just kind of waiting to see what would happen. And they're listening to these 6 others, go running into the cave, and they disappear into the darkness. And they're yelling over and over again for their brothers. And they can still hear the chanting, that death song reverberating off the walls. But then suddenly the cave goes silent again. The chanting stops. All the calling from the 6 men that went in, that stopped too. It's silent again. And it's just the lead warrior, still in the mouth of the cave, next to the one guy. Now they're scared, and they're just listening for anything, but it's just completely quiet. And then, before the lead warrior or the other guy could do anything, that rhythmic chanting began again, the death song. But now it was clearly far more than just a couple of voices. It was this rhythmic, loud, multiple voices layered on top of each other deep inside of this cave, chanting the death song over and over again. At this point, the lead warrior and the other, he had a decision to make. Deep down, he knew it was his responsibility, his moral responsibility here. It was code to go in there. And if you have to sacrifice yourself to get these guys out of there. But he also thought logically something bad is happening inside of this cave, and if me and the other go in there right now, we're not coming out again. And no one's gonna know what happened. There will be no saving. Everyone's just gonna perish. And so, even though it sort of went against every fiber in his body, the lead warrior, as this death song is reverberating off the walls, he and the other, they turned and they ran. Miles and miles, all the way back to their village. And by the time they got there, it was dark out, and they, breathlessly told the tribal chief what had happened. And he said tomorrow, first thing in the morning, first light, we're gonna go back to that cave and we're gonna get those boys out of there. And so sure enough, the next morning at first light, the tribal chief, the lead warrior, and the other man that he was with, the 2 that had come running back from the cave, they, along with about 100 other members of this village, they banded together, and out into the wild they went, retracing these steps all the way back to the cave. And when they got there, the cave was still. It was quiet. There was still light outside, but there was no sign that anybody had come back out of the cave. All the tracks that went into the cave still had not come back out again. So they believe at this point, still, their loved ones are in this cave. They don't know what's happened to them, but they're in there and they have to figure out what's going on. Now at this point, the lead warrior didn't really know what the plan was. I mean, he remembered what happened the day before, and really anyone who went into the cave was seemingly swallowed whole. And so he didn't really have a sense of how they were going to do this. But the tribal chief, he spoke up and he said, I have a plan. We're not going to break up into groups and go into this. This cave wants I to sign and see what happens. We're going to go as one big group. We're going to lock hands in one big line so that we're always connected. Never let go of the person's hands that are left and right of you. And the lead warrior and the other man, they're going to lead us into the cave in the direction of where they heard their brothers when they went in there. And we're all going to trail, and as one, we're going to walk into this cave until we find our missing people. And we're going to get them out of there. And so the lead warrior thought this was actually a brilliant idea. We'll all be together. We'll be holding on to each other. Nothing can happen to us this way. And so the lead warrior was second in line. The man who was leading the line was basically the other guy he was with, the two that had run back. He was the other guy. So he's in front. The lead warrior is second. He's locked hands with this guy. And then behind him is basically about 100 other people, all holding on to each other's hands. One big line. And when they were ready, the lead warrior and the man in front of him, they began moving into this cave. And so into the cave they went. And as they're walking, they can tell pretty quickly that the cave, it sort of turns to the right. You have to walk in, maybe 50 or so feet into the cave. But then it sharp rights. And so there's enough light coming in that you can basically walk all the way up to that turn. But then, when the lead warrior and the man in front of him made that sharp right and they began walking that way, it was utterly pitch black. No light reached that section of the tunnel, but, they're leading the line, and so they're still just moving along, and the whole line's following them pretty slowly. As they're walking, like the lead warrior, it's like he kept trying to blink his eyes to just try to capture anything, but he can't see anything. It is pitch black, and he's just gripping onto the men in front and behind him as tight as he can to show solidarity, like we're here together. We're gonna be okay. And as they're walking, the lead guy kept calling out the names of the many men at this point that were lost in this cave, but there's no response. And as they're walking and shuffling along again, they can't see anything. The walls are getting tight. They hear from somewhere deep in the cave the death song. The chant begins low and slow, and it begins to build and gets louder and louder and louder and louder. And at this point, because they're all locked together, you can't really get out very quickly. They're well into the cave at this point. They can't see anything, and it's like the walls are echoing and it's booming in their chest. Chants? This chants that's only done when you're on the brink of death. And so, as they're walking along into the lead warrior, he's trying to grip as hard as he can to the man in front and behind him, showing them, keep going now. It's gonna be okay. But then he felt the hand of the man in front of him, the line leader, go slack. And before he could grab it again, the man's hand was out of his, and he's reaching out in front of him, and he can't see him. But he can't feel him either. It was like he vanished. And so now, the lead warrior, he's the front of the line. He has no idea what's going on, and he wants to just stop and turn and leave. It's getting so overwhelming. And he's about to do that, but he just feels like there's this force pulling him deeper into the cave. And then, before he can do anything else, he opens his mouth, and he begins to chant the death song. At the same time this is happening deep inside of this cave, the tribal chief, along with a couple of others who had not joined the line, they were still outside of the cave. They've heard something going on in the cave, but it's dull. They can't really hear too much. There's something going on, but there's 100 people walking into the cave. They presumed there'd be noise. But suddenly, there was this obvious commotion, panic erupting from deep inside of the cave. And before he knew it, all these people are coming running out of the cave, scared to death. like bombing out of the cave. And at this point, the tribal chief knows something horrible's happened. As he rounds everybody up, he does a head count and realizes over a dozen people are gone. They did not come back out again. And the cave that minutes ago was full of this death song, and chaos and panic is silent once again. At this point, the tribal chief sort of designated that it must be the case that there's something evil inside of this cave. There's an evil spirit. There's something in this cave that is taking our people, and they're vanishing. They're being swallowed whole by this cave. It's evil. And so from that moment, he forbid anyone from the tribe of ever stepping foot in this cave again. We cannot lose anyone else. Our best bet is to go back to the village and hope that these men, these brave warriors, eventually find their way out again. And so the tribal chief and the rest of these devastated villagers, back to the village they went. And over the next couple of days and weeks, no one came out of that cave. And as weeks turn into months, it's like the villagers, they couldn't really move on because they were not able to collect their loved ones' bodies or get any sort of closure. It's just this unbelievable mystery, this terrifying mystery that had ripped the entire tribe apart. And so eventually, after months and months had passed and still no one has any idea what's happened, no one's come out of that cave, the tribal chief finally just said, "We are going to basically board up the cave. We're going to cover it with rocks. Effectively, it is now a tomb, and that'll be that. No one will ever go back in. This cave will never claim another life." So that's what they did. They used huge boulders and they completely blocked the entrance, and that was it. Now, that was the story that the Ho-Chunk Nation passed down for generations about what happened to all those people, the warriors and the teenagers and all these people, that they were swallowed alive by this cave. And over many years, many members of this tribe, that heard the story, they didn't know what to make of it. Is it real? Is it just folklore? We don't know. But then in 1930, so hundreds of years later, a chilling discovery was made. So in 1930, there was this guy named Paul Seifert, who in Richland County, Wisconsin, he was sort of a well-known antique dealer. And something he really liked to do was he would go hiking in the forests of Richland County, the rolling hills, and he would look for indigenous artifacts that were left behind from, like the Ho-Chunk Nation and other indigenous tribes that were in the area. Sometimes he'd find, an arrowhead or something on the ground or pottery or whatever it was. But he liked hiking. He liked being out in nature. And this was something he would look for. And if he found something good enough, he could sell it in his antique shop. And so he's out walking the hills of Richland County, and he's well off the trail. He's sort of out in the sticks, and he finds this ravine. And he walks down the ravine, and it comes to this clearing of sorts. And he notices on the other side of the ravine, the slope that goes back up. He saw what looked to be almost like a memorial or something. Like a stack of rocks that looked sort of out of place, and there was like moss and grass that sort of grown over it. But he immediately identified that there's a mound of something here that looks a little bit out of place. And so he walks over and he begins sort of pulling off some of the rocks. And he realizes pretty quickly that this was put here on purpose. This pile of rocks, these boulders and all this was put here on purpose. And so after pulling off enough of these rocks, he realizes that there's a cave on the other side. Now, it would take quite a bit of work too to pull off enough rocks that he could actually get himself inside of this cave, but eventually he did. And once he was inside of this cave, the same cave the Ho-Chunk Nation had dealt with hundreds of years earlier, he's like, wow, like this cave, it's been blocked off. I wonder what's inside of here. Maybe there are incredible indigenous artifacts inside of here. And so, feeling really motivated to explore this cave, he left, went back, got some basic supplies including a lantern, and then he came back another day. 'Cause this is well off the beaten path. No one's gonna stumble upon this. And into the cave he went. And so, He's in this cave and he walks, all the way to the end where it banks to the right. He turns and he starts walking, and the ceiling of this cave begins to come down and it's getting really tight on him. But he's so excited to see what's in here because he knows this has been blocked off on purpose. There's something in here. And so eventually the ceiling gets so low that he's crawling with this lantern. And right as he's thinking, this is so narrow I don't know if I can fit, he pulls himself under this one really low section, and everything just opens up. It's like this grand cathedral in the middle of this cave. And he holds out his light, he kind of stands up and he holds out his light, and it's just this massive space. And right away he sees something on the ground. There are all these neat rows of human skeletons, and they're all positioned the same way. It's like they're kneeling with their hands over their head, like they're bowing. All of them. You couldn't even count how many skeletons are all positioned here, right in the middle of this cavern. And so, he's looking at all of these bodies and he's gasping. He can't believe it. And he brings the light sort of in the direction that all these bodies are aiming towards. All the bodies are praying towards. And carved into the rock is this enormous chair, like a throne. And there was nothing on the throne. And Paul, when he saw that and all these bodies, and just the fact that he's deep inside of this cave, he was spooked. Even though there could have been a sea of artifacts he could have taken, he just turned and he bolted. He crawled out of there and he left the cave as fast as he could. And the reason we know about the story is because Paul, after this experience, he got in touch with a local newspaper. It's called the Milwaukee Journal, and he spoke to a journalist about what he saw. And they reported it. They reported that he found these skeletons in this throne and it's inside of this cave that was blocked off. And there's allusions to the story of the Ho-Chunk Nation. It's like this totally cryptic story. But in 1930, and even still today, we're left with a couple of distinct questions. One, what happened to all these people? And two, who or what was sitting on that throne? Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch here. Alright, until next time. See ya. Have you ever wondered what happens when you die? Well, today I'm gonna tell you 3 stories that all give insights into what might actually happen. And these are not hokey stories. These are stories with, evidence, photographic evidence in some cases. These are deep, unsettling stories. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and flip all of their wall-mounted TVs upside down. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the evening of December 27th, 1984, a 16-year-old boy named John Bull sat in the passenger seat of his best friend's Jeep as they drove down a residential road in St. Paul, Minnesota. John's best friend was driving, and 2 more of their friends from school were in the back seat. They were all talking and laughing and singing along to the radio. It was dark outside, and it was rainy and kind of an awful night, but John didn't care. He was way too excited because that night, he and his buddies were on their way to see the megastar musician Prince perform live. So Prince was obviously a massive star at the time, and anyone at the time would have been pretty excited to go see him perform live. But this was a particularly big deal for John and his friends because Prince was actually from Minneapolis, Minnesota, which was just 20 minutes away from St. Paul where they were from. So it was kind of like they were going to see their hometown hero. Now, John and his friends didn't expect to become, huge rock star gods like Prince. But there was just something about seeing, this hometown guy achieve his dreams on an international scale. It was just really inspiring. And so again, John and his friends are just so stoked about this concert. They can't wait to get there. And so John, with all this excitement, he turns around to talk to his friends in the back seat about this concert and how great it's gonna be. Right as he turns around, he hears a loud screeching sound. And he whips his head back around just in time to see the headlights of the car aimed at this tree that they're careening straight towards. He screams. He hears his friends screaming. They smash into the tree, and everything goes dark. A few minutes later, a St. Paul police officer named Brian Coyle and his patrol partner pulled up behind the now-wrecked Jeep. They'd been on their regular patrol when they'd gotten a call about the car crash. Now, the call hadn't come from anybody in the crash, so they really didn't know what to expect. Now, when Coyle stepped out of his own car and walked towards the wreck, it was raining and dark out. And the visibility wasn't great, but right away he saw there were 3 teenagers who were standing upright outside of the car. Now, they looked pretty shaken up, and they visibly had some cuts on their body, but, overall his assessment was they were basically okay. And so, while Coyle's partner went to go examine the wreck itself, Coyle walked up to these teenagers, and one of them, through tears, explained to Coyle that he had been driving. And he said he had been just going too fast, and he tried to take a sharp turn and he hydroplaned, lost control, and they hit the tree. And then the driver said it didn't matter, though, how this happened, because what mattered now is his friend John is still in the car and he's not moving. And so Officer Coyle left the teenagers and told them to stay, and he walked over to the wreck where his partner was. And Coyle, he knelt down and he looked inside the Jeep, and he saw the other teenager, John, slumped over inside the passenger seat, and he wasn't moving. And so Coyle asked his partner, "Hey, have you checked him? Is he okay?" And the partner looked at Coyle and just said, "No, he's dead." So Officer Coyle took a deep breath, and while his partner called for backup and taped off the scene, Coyle went back to John's friends and broke the news as gently as he could. But of course, they were all devastated. The only thing Coyle could do to help them was to call an ambulance to come and take them to the hospital to get checked out. Once the ambulance had taken them away, and once John's body had been removed from the Jeep, Officer Coyle and his partner began to document the scene by taking photos of the crashed car with a camera. Now, this was all standard practice, and so while they did it, they didn't think anything of it. However, about a week later, when Coyle and his partner were reviewing the photos they took, Coyle noticed something shocking. One of the pictures that Officer Coyle had taken was so bizarre that it ended up in newspapers, not only in Minnesota, but all over the country. Even today, 30 plus years later, people are still talking about it. And when you see this photo, you'll understand why. This is the photograph, and if you look at the top, right above the Jeep's open door, you'll see something that could just be a flash of light. But to Officer Coyle and so many others who have looked at this photograph, they say that weird apparition-looking thing above the Jeep looks eerily similar to John Bulwer's face, the 16-year-old victim of the car crash. And it almost looks like this photograph captured, the moment of John's spirit departing Earth, like it's showing his final moment in life, like when he died screaming as the car is about to crash into this tree. One evening in the summer of 1974, a 60-year-old doctor named Julian Kirk sat beside his backyard pool at his home in Old Westbury, New York, which is a suburb of New York City. It was a quiet, sunny day, and Dr. Kirk was glad to have some time to relax. He was a surgeon at a local hospital, and he also had a wife and 4 children, so it was not often that he got a moment of peace to himself. So Dr. Kirk leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes and tried to relax for a second, when all of a sudden, he heard something rustle in the bushes nearby. Now, at first he just figured it must be a squirrel or a bird or something, so he didn't even bother opening his eyes. This is just nature. It's fine. But this rustling sound persisted, and it just wouldn't stop. And so eventually Dr. Kirk did open his eyes, and he got up out of his chair to go see what was going on. Now, these bushes were, 20 feet away from the doctor, and so in order to truly investigate, he had to get up and actually walk over there. So he gets up and he takes a few steps when he suddenly freezes because now, when he's looking at the bushes, he sees there is someone standing, basically in the bushes, a person. But he realized this person was not a normal-looking person. The person was wearing what appeared to be this dark, long robe that covered their whole body. And in fact, the robe kind of obscured their face. It was like they were this dark presence just standing there in the middle of these bushes. And so Drive. Kirk IK is just frozen, having no idea how to react to this. I mean, does he call out for help? Does he, chase this guy out of his yard? Like, what does he do here? And as he's standing there transfixed, this person in the robe extends one of their arms. This long, skinny arm, and kind of begins to beckon Dr. Kirk IK towards them. And Dr. Kirk IK went from being sort of startled to being terrified. This figure basically looked like the Grim Reaper. And it felt like now the Grim Reaper is beckoning him to come with him, to come die, basically. That was the feeling he suddenly had, and it was unbelievably overwhelming. And so Dr. Kirk IK is staring, horrified. He blinks for a second, and the man is gone. Over the next few days, Dr. Kirk IK obsessed over what he had just seen. I mean, really, it felt like he had just witnessed the Grim Reaper. And worse, that the Grim Reaper was, like, telling him to come with him. Like he was signaling to Dr. Kirk IK that his time on Earth had come to an end, that his death was imminent. That's what Dr. Kirk IK is thinking. But Dr. Kirk IK, he's a surgeon. He's a man of science and reason, and he can't understand how this could have happened. I mean, even if it was just a hallucination, it was so vivid. It was so visceral. Like, how could this be Muzz? What's going on with him? The problem Drive. Kirk IK had was, who's he gonna talk to about this? Hey, by the way, I saw the Grim Reaper, and now I'm worried I'm gonna die soon, or maybe somebody in my family's gonna die soon, or a patient is gonna die soon. Like, who's gonna have that conversation with him? But at the same time that he was feeling increasingly isolated because of this, whatever he saw, he couldn't help but feel like it was real, that it was driving him mad. Like, I'm not doing anything and something bad is imminent. What do I do? And so for months, Dr. Kirk IK just carried this incredible weight with him everywhere he went, like this constant sense of unease. Until October of 1974. That month, Dr. Kirk IK suddenly got sick. He had a fever and it just wouldn't go away. And so he went to his own doctor for a checkup, and his doctor told him, I got some bad news. That day, Dr. Kirk IK was diagnosed with an incurable form of blood cancer. He was heartbroken, but he was not totally surprised because, for him, this sort of felt like a validation of what he'd already seen. Death, the Grim Reaper, had been calling him. And now Kirk IK knew why. Dr. Kirk IK would share his story with newspapers, which is how we know about it today. And shortly after sharing his story, Dr. Kirk IK would die. Hey guys, I have a really cool announcement for you. So right now, if you head over to shop MrBallen's.com, you will find brand new, limited time merch items on our site. We have the brand new signature Mr. Ballen hat. Okay, you gotta wear that backwards. Of course, there's the black version, and also we have the white mesh version as well. Very cool. It's the thumbs up logo. Very nice, cool hat. And then of course, we also have this nifty new flannel color. Okay, yellow really fits the vibe of the fall season. Okay, get yourself one of these. But remember, these are limited time items just for the fall, so get them while you can. Again, that is shop Mr. Ballen. Come. You got the new flannel? The multiple versions of the hat that you gotta wear backwards. Go check it out. Again, shop Mr. Ballen. Come. Thank you. On the afternoon of Sunday, August 27th, 2000, a 50-year-old husband and father named Bruce Leininger sat in his living room in Lafayette, Louisiana. He and his wife and his 2-year-old son, James, had just gotten home from church, and now Bruce was just trying to relax. However, it was proving very difficult to relax because as Bruce is trying to sit on the couch and just trying to close his eyes for a second, his son James, the 2-year-old, has his toy plane, his favorite toy plane, and he is repeatedly smashing it into the coffee table as loud as he can, saying, "Plane crash, plane crash, plane crash." And while, of course, James is a kid. He's gonna be loud and noisy and obnoxious. That's what kids do. But for Bruce too, he's watching his son do this, and he couldn't help but be really concerned. Because lately, like over the past few months, James had become unnaturally fixated, not on planes, but on plane crashes. And even more specifically, James had begun having these recurring nightmares, like 4 or 5 times a week, where he'd wake up terrified. And he would say James, had just been in a horrible, fiery plane crash. And it was like every night that was the nightmare. And it was like Bruce and his wife didn't even know what to make of this. Like, where is he getting this from? James was a pretty sheltered kid. Like, he wasn't being exposed to, horrible plane crashes either in movies or TV shows or books. I mean, he's a 2-year-old. It just made no sense that he was having this recurring nightmare. But what made it even more kind of unsettling is that James wasn't just fixated on the plane crash aspect of this nightmare. He also began to tell Bruce and his wife these weird details about the plane crash. Cause it was always the same plane crash. In his nightmare, he began telling his parents that the Japanese shot me down. And Bruce and his wife are like, what is he referencing? Like, is this a World War II reference? But again, these two, like, developmentally, it's not something he would say even if he was exposed to it. Like, it just didn't make any sense. Now, over the past few months that this behavior had really ramped up, Bruce and his wife had taken James to the doctor to say, what's going on here? Like, what's my kid doing? I don't understand any of this. And the doctors were all like, nah, he's a kid. Like, yeah, it's a weird fixation he's got, but he'll grow out of it. Like, don't worry about it. But to Bruce and his wife, it just seemed like James was not growing out of it. He was just getting more and more fixated as time went on. And so as Bruce is sitting there on the couch, watching James for the millionth time smash his toy plane into the coffee table and pretend it was this plane crash he couldn't stop thinking about, Bruce decided he had to do something about this. And so, over the next couple of months, Bruce, instead of trying to figure out what was wrong with James that was causing him to fixate on this plane crash, instead of doing that, he began sort of like leaning in and asking James to give him more information about whatever he was seeing in his nightmare. Like, give me all the specifics you can possibly recall. And James would eventually let on that it wasn't just the Japanese that shot him down, it was the Japanese military. And also the type of plane that James was flying in apparently was a Corsair airplane. Bruce had never heard of that before. And again, he's looking at his 2-year-old son thinking, how do you even know what a Corsair airplane is? But nonetheless, that's what James said. And so, Bruce doesn't know what to do with this information, but again, he's just trying to learn. And so in November of that year, Bruce found himself sitting in the living room. And he had this World War II coffee table book that he had actually purchased for his father, but he hadn't given it to him yet. And he saw James, playing with his plane, smashing it into the coffee table. And Bruce, he grabs this coffee table book full of pictures of pilots in combat and war, and he flips to pictures of pilots from World War II. Cause now, Bruce is thinking maybe his son somehow is imagining a scene from World War II. A pilot has crashed in World War II. The Japanese military shot them down. I don't know, no idea how he got this image, but that could be what he's thinking about. And so he's like, well, maybe I'll just start looking at pictures from World War II of pilots, and maybe somehow or another James will look at this and something will click for him. Bruce really didn't know what he was trying to get out of this, but either way, he called James over and he shows him this book. And he's like, James, do you recognize any of these planes? Like, are any of these planes the Corsair airplane that you flew, in your dream? Is any of this stuff sort of lining up with your dream? Again, he's talking to a 2-year-old, but the 2-year-old sort of got it. James looked at the pages, but nothing clicked. James sort of reached down and was just kind of flipping through all the pages, and there was no connection with James. But towards the end of the coffee table book, where Bruce is thinking like, What am I even doing here? I'm like, prompting my 2-year-old to research World War II with me. Like, what is this? What is going on here? But as James is flipping the pages, he suddenly stops and he points at one of the pages and he says to his dad, "That's where I was shot down." And he's pointing at the Battle of Iwo Jima. And so Bruce, again, he doesn't really know what he's trying to accomplish here. But clearly his son has pointed out this particular fact that's sort of roughly tied in with the other things he's brought up. He's had this dream about being a pilot who crashes cause the Japanese military shot him down. He's highlighting a battle in Japan during World War II where, the Allies were fighting the Axis powers and the Japanese, could have been shooting somebody down. So it sort of made sense. Okay, fine. Maybe my son's dream is about something that happened at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Don't know how this even happens. Don't know how this is possible. But I'm gonna do some research. And so that's what Bruce does. He begins researching the Battle of Iwo Jima. Doesn't even really know what he's looking for, but he just wants to see if there's anything connected to what his son has been saying. And what he eventually discovers, actually, is sort of a relief. He discovers that there is no record of any Corsair airplanes crashing during the Battle of Iwo Jima. In fact, no Corsair airplanes at all were flown during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And his son, James, had been saying specifically, "I flew a Corsair airplane." Like, that was the plane that crashed. And so he's thinking, okay, there's a hole in my son's story. Like, he clearly must have latched on to some event. Somehow somebody said it to him. He heard it, whatever it is. And in his 2-year-old mind, he sort of warped it, and that's what he believes happened. But it's not real. Like, he's not actually recalling something that happened in the Battle of Iwo Jima. Like, this is just, a false memory or something. However, Bruce was unable to definitively find the names of pilots who actually flew in the Battle of Iwo Jima. He wanted to find if there were any pilots named James who potentially crashed, during that battle, but he just couldn't find the information. Maybe it existed somewhere, but he couldn't find it. And so Bruce had this idea to get in touch with this old veterans group, all these old guys who had served in the Battle of Iwo Jima that were still alive. They were based out in San Diego. They got together periodically and just sort of had social hours and stuff like that. And Bruce, he goes out to San Diego and, under false pretenses, he basically tells the group that he's shooting a documentary about the Battle of Iwo Jima and he needs some information, about certain pilots that flew during the battle. He goes out there. He goes to one of their social events and he begins asking around, asking if anybody knew about any pilots named James who were shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And basically, all the men he talked to directed him to go talk to the group's historian, this one guy who kind of had all the information about what had happened during this battle. And so Bruce goes over to this guy. He starts asking him questions about, any pilots that, were shot down during the battle. Do you don't know? And the historian, he tells Bruce that during that battle, virtually no planes were shot down. However, there was one plane that was shot down. A single U. Yes. Air Force pilot was shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima and he was killed. And that pilot's name was James Houston Jr. Bruce couldn't help but be truly shocked that the only pilot shot down during the Battle of Iwo Jima happened to be named James. Like, that just seemed like a coincidence that couldn't be possible considering what his son was saying. And so, suddenly, Bruce doesn't know what to make of this information he's been given. For so long, his 2-year-old son named James has been talking about how, in his dream, he's been shot down by the Japanese military during the Battle of Iwo Jima. And now he's being told there was a single pilot shot down in real life during the Battle of Iwo Jima, and his name was James. Like, how is that possible? That just seems impossible. And so at this point, Bruce is really holding on to the fact that his son had said his plane that he was shot down in was a Corsair airplane. And this guy, James Houston Jr., who was shot down, the plane he was shot down in was not a Corsair airplane. And so Bruce is telling himself, like, okay, this is just a crazy coincidence. Like, this didn't somehow happen to my son. He's not, like, channeling somebody else who died years ago. Like, that can't be what's happening, hero. This is just a wild set of circumstances. That's all this is. But he's freaked out now. And so he calls his wife and he tells her about what he's learned. And he kind of downplays how much this has really unsettled him. But he ultimately tells his wife, and the two of them decide, okay, you know what? Let's just do a little bit more research and just figure out what's going on here. Like, this is just so crazy. We gotta do a little bit more research. And in doing research about James Houston Jr., they discover that James has a sister who is still alive. And so they decide to contact her. Not really even sure what they're gonna say, but they figure, you know what? Let's just get in touch with her and just tell her what's going on. Who knows? Maybe somehow she can explain this. Who knows? And so, kind of on a whim, James and his wife, they send a message to this woman, to the sister. And the sister, when she finds out there's this 2-year-old who's sort of referencing her brother's death in some way for whatever reason, her reaction was to send actual physical photographs of James Houston Jr. when he was a pilot, when he served in the military. She just sent a whole bunch of pictures to Bruce, his wife, and James to look at. Like, there really wasn't a clear set of what do we do now. And so, that's what she did. Here are some pictures. And when Bruce looked at these photos, it was like his whole world was completely rocked. Because in one of the photos that clearly showed James Houston Jr., he is standing in front of a plane, and that plane was a Corsair airplane. And so at this point for Bruce, it felt like the set of circumstances, the coincidences here, were simply too much to ignore. This is no longer coincidence. This is something else. And also, there's one other small detail that now was sort of bubbling up in Bruce's mind, and that was, periodically, his son James would talk about how he really wasn't named James. It was named James 3. Just periodically, his son would say that. Not every time, but he brought it up enough that it was sort of a known thing that he was James Dreams 3. And now Bruce is thinking, James Houston Jr., that's James 2. My son. How could he possibly know all these things that happened to James Houston Jr. if he was not James 3, James Houston Jr.'s reincarnated soul? Bruce would eventually take his son's story to the news, and the family would film a primetime segment on ABC about it. James was soon invited to the Battle of Iwo Jima Veterans Reunion, where he would shock the group with his knowledge of the battle. James also met James Houston Jr.'s sister, and when he did, he called her by a nickname that only her late brother ever used. After that, even she was convinced that her brother's spirit had come back to Earth in James Dreams 3. If reincarnation is real, James's story is one of the most credible and well-documented cases in history. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here, so give it a watch here. Alright, until next time, see you.